There's a new musical that's about to open, and boldly it declares that it's going to retell the story of the crucifixion and do so from the perspective of Judas. The advanced publicity is massive, as will become a hallmark of the coming age of the megamusicals, and the theme of the show has not escaped notice. No less an evangelical figure than Billy Graham himself said the show was, quote, bordering on blasphemy and sacrilege, end quote. His concern about the content is shared. In a rare moment of agreement between Graham and the National Secular Society, both groups showed up to protest the opening of the show. The Secular Society handed out leaflets entitled, quote, Jesus Christ, Supersham, end quote. The Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee also responded rather strongly to the show. Ted Neely, who had played the role of Jesus in scores of those productions, looked back at the role after he had passed his 80th year. He said, quote, but the controversy the show stirred up, I gotta tell you, it was very strange. Our production company said, no matter what they may say to you, don't say anything because they might punch you right in the face. And so we were silent, end quote. But the show would not be silenced. Would the controversy shut the show down? Would the protesters block the doors? Or would the show simply go on? We'll talk about how the audiences, the critics, and the world reacted to the opening of Jesus Christ Superstar in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Before we dive in, just a quick plea for your help in keeping this show going. There is now a standard part of every podcast and every other one where the host comes on and asks for help. But this is a medium where audience involvement really does make or break you. There are very few shows that have any sort of advertising budget. And God bless this postmodern, crazy confluence world called podcasting. I am actually quite happy to say that this age of social media bots and artificial intelligence, podcast audiences mostly trust each other. Your short involvement as a real human being can make a big difference to this real human being. And if you could take a moment to give the show a rating, take an episode you find interesting, and drop the link on your own social media feed, these are the things that really will make a difference. And as always, thank you for dropping in to listen. I really do work hard to make sure there's stuff here worth listening to that you can't get anywhere else. And the fact that you have taken me up on this offer means more than you can know. We are now at the fourth episode covering Jesus Christ Superstar. The first two dealt with the issues involved in interpreting the Bible and the Judas story in particular. And the last episode traced the development of the show from the very first time that Tim Rice met Andrew Lloyd Webber until the show was first performed on Broadway, and then when it subsequently opened in London and then briefly made a appearance as film. Today, we'll talk about how that show was received. And as always, we'll try to figure out what that has in it that has made the show work and what the show has to say about theater and life. But normally, when you're talking about the reaction of the show, the only real question is, did the audiences like it? And maybe did the critics like it? And maybe did it have a life after its initial run? But that is all totally different if you are retelling the story of Jesus Christ. Like you have invited a very strong reaction from an issue that a lot of people care about very deeply. You can try running away from it, but you really can't. And so trying to figure out, given what we have now learned on this podcast about the Judas story and about the way the Bible has been interpreted over the years, this story that is a reinterpretation of a biblical story is definitely going to spark some reaction. What was that reaction? What do different religious groups think of the show? What did audiences think of it? And then what can we make of it? That's the topic that we're going to take on today. There are at least three elements that go into the way that the audiences and the critics reacted to the show. To recap some of what we've already covered in the last three episodes that will be relevant here, Jesus Christ Superstar is a proto-megamusical. That is, when we now think of Broadway smash hits, we think about things like Cats or Les Mis that run for decades and make literally billions of dollars. And it's worth mentioning that the entire phenomena is very strongly linked to Andrew Lloyd Webber, and only to a slightly lesser extent the Andrew Lloyd Webber Tim Rice team. They kind of invented the mega musical together. But none of that was in place in the early 1970s when the show first came out. There wasn't really such a thing as a mega musical yet, and Andrew Lloyd Webber was not yet the Andrew Lloyd Webber, who many complain rightly or wrongly is now virtually critic-proof. Jesus Christ Superstar is a show that is going to have to win over its audiences, and to a roughly equal extent, its critics, because those critics will define whether or not the show goes forward. And the big show on Broadway at that point was Hair, which was directed by a guy named Tom O'Horgan. And Hair, too, was a plot-light exploration of hippie culture. I guess the hippie part was different from Jesus Christ Superstar, but much like Jesus Christ Superstar and Cats, Hair was not strong on plot, but it was succeeding in doing so by pushing the boundaries of how you rehearsed, how the actors related to each other, how far you could push the fourth wall, how many totally nude actors you could put on the stage and still not violate basic public decency laws, and wrap it all around some very innovative music. Invigorating, exciting, maybe rock music. The world was moving from Lawrence Welk to the Beatles in the mid-1960s, and Hair was at the cutting edge of how new rock-oriented musical styles were going to play out on Broadway. So to set the stage, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice are the new kids. They have not had a musical produced before. O'Horgan, as the director of Hair, is the established guy with some Broadway chops. And the genre of the mega musical is in its very earliest stages. So back to our three key elements that now define how the show will be received. We've got the context. What are the possible reactions? Well, first, it is about Judas and about Jesus, which makes it a religious show, and that is just not possible to avoid. The world comes to the crucifixion story with some pretty strongly held opinions and preconceived notions, and that's going to impact the reaction of the show. Second of all, the show is based on a hugely successful musical album, and that's never been done before. There have been cast recordings, of course, but nobody has used a pop music release as a vehicle to launch a musical theater production before. That's going to be new, and that will influence the reaction. And third, there is the question about how the hippie-style avant-garde directing of Tom O'Horgan is going to mesh with the religious themes and the ideas of Rice and Lloyd Webber. So let's take those in order, and we will start with the religion question. The first thing to quickly dispense with is that the creators insisted that they were not making a religious statement, and were telling the crucifixion story from the perspective of Judas as a creative choice. Now, we talked about this in the prior episode, where you can find the footnotes to all this, but this isn't really something that we can take seriously. You can't really say that the Book of Mormon isn't really about missionaries and that it's just a creative choice. You can't write a comic book with a bunch of pictures of Muhammad and say that it's just creative choice, or write something called, say, the Satanic Verses and say that you aren't saying something about Islam, so it's all cool. Without rehashing it all too much, the show does have something to say about who Judas is, and inherent in that is saying something about who Jesus was. And the Jesus in this story is much different from how he is commonly understood by Christians. He's much more indecisive. He might not be divine, and the show, at the end of it, he isn't even necessarily resurrected. The show just kind of ends with Judas still wondering if Jesus is a divine entity, and it doesn't really answer that question at all. But that stance, that Jesus might or might not be divine, and the part of him that was human predominated the final days of his life, that definitely fits neatly with some theologies and rather flagrantly clashes with others. So like it or not, if you write a play about Judas and Jesus and you take the conceit of portraying what they were thinking as the events played out, you are making a theological statement, and you're going to get a reaction from the religious adherents. So amongst the Christians, there are at least two possible reactions, and they are opposites. The first possible reaction is that the Christians are going to love the show because it thrusts the Jesus story back into public attention, true to its title, in a world where pop culture and entertainment have basically displaced the Universal Catholic Church as the center of cultural life and thought. Making Jesus a superstar, a new pop icon, gives him a new relevance to a world that has dominated what we now call the attention economy. Power, prominence, political attention, and cultural direction are all dependent on how well you can capture and hold the attention of the mass public. It used to be that all a pope had to do was release a statement or an encyclical or a speech. And if it was the 15th century, that was so central to everything that was going on that was basically all that a pope had to do. Everyone was paying attention to the pope. If the pope said it, it was news. And that just wasn't true in the 1960s anymore. If you want to have an effect on culture in the 1960s, well, Elvis Presley or John Lennon might have more sway over the young minds than Pope Paul VI. So one view was that the 1960s were bringing in a new, energetic, and youthful infusion of ideas into everything. And the same thing was happening in modern Christianity, and especially the various evangelically oriented Protestant movements. There's reason to suspect that those of this ilk were going to take the show. Our old friend Jessica Sternfeld, now of Chapman University and the author of the book titled Megamusical, which has basically become the Bible for this podcast so far, wrote this, quote, "Jesus, it seemed, was in fashion. In popular music of the late 1960s and early 1970s, references to Jesus and religion in general were becoming increasingly frequent. Oft-cited examples of the spiritual Jesus rock movement include the Beatles' Let It Be, Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, and Neil Diamond's version of He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother. These singles dealt with the idea of brotherhood and a general spirituality. More specific examples of Jesus rock abounded in songs like Remember Bethlehem, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up, and Jesus Is Just All Right. Time magazine pointed out that Jesus could be found not only in pop music, but on all sorts of merchandise, like bathing suits and wristwatches. He was a fad among America's youth. For some more liberal-minded churches, this was a boon as they drew new worshipers by incorporating popular music into their services and classes, end quote. Catherine Post, who was writing for the National Catholic Review, had a similar take. Catherine wrote, quote, "The album arrived just as Christian rock was beginning to emerge in the U.S. Norman Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky was a chart topper in the 1970s, and the Jesus Peoples movement was blending the electric sounds of 60s counterculture with evangelicalism," end quote. John Dart, writing for the LA Times in 1973, noted that both a U.S. Catholic newsletter and a publication called The Christian Century both liked the show, as we talked about in the last episode, and we'll recap in a minute. There's no way you can say that Jesus Christ Superstar is a story that is true to the biblical story of crucifixion. So these reviews don't so much like that it's a faithful retelling of the gospel story, so much that it's a telling of the gospel story, and that's kind of a big deal. It made the cover of Time magazine, who did not review it very positively, but it made the Jesus story a big enough deal that was front and center once again in American culture. Now, one final connection I find especially tasty comes from Larry Norman, an early Christian rocker. So in the 1970s and 80s, rock music was taking on its defining edge with electric guitars and Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page style solos. Bob Dylan would famously convert to Christianity, sort of, and he was a huge cultural influence on everything. In fact, those guitar-using worship services that those quotes we just read we're referencing are now ubiquitous in Protestant and Catholic and Jewish circles. And you can draw all of them back to a pretty straight line between those and Bob Dylan. You could go to a Catholic youth service, a Jewish youth service, or even their normal services. And it's just ubiquitous to see someone standing in front of a group with an acoustic guitar singing what might be praise music or Christian songs or even something like Amazing Grace. But that is a style that has been fully adopted in contemporary religious worship services. There's, a single singer with an acoustic guitar playing 3 or 4 chord songs like Dylan used to. And for those musicians who were into music by people like Dylan, but had collapsed out of the free love, drug-heavy culture that embraced Christianity as a faith and alternative lifestyle, the idea was to play rock music, but with Christian lyrics. And Larry Norman was one of those guys. He was very influential in this movement. He kind of sang like Neil Young. He wore all black like Johnny Cash, and like Dylan himself, he played an upbeat brand of rock music with electric guitars. So in 1966, John Lennon famously commented that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, a statement for which he issued a public apology, but he could never really live down. And in 1973, Norman released a song called Only Visiting This Planet, where he laments the state of rock music, including Bowie, Alice Cooper, Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, and then right in the middle of the song, he drops this couplet, quote, "This time last year, people didn't want to hear. They looked at Jesus from afar. And this year, he's a superstar," end quote. And then dropping into his purest Johnny Cash sing talk, he added this comment, "Dear John, who's more popular now?" That anecdote, I think, fairly captures the Jesus Christ Superstar capitalized on a new Jesus popularity side of the reaction. There are some who will feel there is a rising Jesus market that entertainers can tap into, and this anticipates the reaction will be positive in a way that will, maybe cynically, boost the commercial success of the show. There are people who think Jesus Christ Superstar is capitalizing on the Jesus rock movement. That's becoming popular, so the show's going to become popular. Maybe that's good, maybe that's cynical, but one way or another, it is linked to the Jesus movement. And they're going to like it. Larry Norman sure did. The exact opposite view, of course, is that the show is going to offend Christians because it's not true to the gospel and it has what might be a heretical view of Jesus. This should stimulate protest. It should get the show banned, and that should hurt its commercial success. I will indulge a quick look forward and backward on this. Looking back in the previous episodes, we learned that it isn't really possible to tell a crucifixion story that is true to the Gospels. First of all, translating any biblical text exactly isn't even possible. There are many, many ambiguities in many, many different translations. There are no surviving copies of any New Testament book written in the hand of the reputed original author. So all we have are the translations of translations that are themselves copies of copies. Now, this might give an artist a fairly free license to expand the text. Second of all, the Gospels themselves are contradictory. In some accounts, Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. In others, Jesus just turns himself in. In some accounts, Judas hangs himself. In others, he explodes. Yep, literally explodes. In some Gospels, he returns the silver coins, and the priests buy a field that is cursed. They buy it with the money. And other Gospels have it that Judas buys the field. Then he kills himself, and then the field is cursed. But if nothing else, the crucifixion story plays out in many different books and not as a single narrative. So if you're going to dramatize it, whether it be Godspell or Willem Dafoe in The Last Temptation of Christ, you're going to have to make some creative choices just to get the thing from the Bible to a stage or the screen. Every attempt to make a Jesus movie, and there are lots of them, are going to have to do this. Ian Mills of Hamilton College put it this way, quote, "Every cinematic Jesus combines and conflates the Gospels into a single streamlined story. Superstar is no exception," end quote. But even against that backdrop, Jesus Christ Superstar took some liberties. As we discussed in the last episode, Tim Rice took the Bible as a starting place. Then he used a book written by a bishop to help him interpret it. And then he just kind of went rogue to do whatever he thought would work and make the show better. Mark Goodacre, who boasts affiliations at both the University of Birmingham and Duke, put it this way. Duke, by the way, has a much better basketball team. Quote, "Jesus Christ Superstar harmonizes events from different Gospels in a way breathtaking to any biblical scholar with sensitivities to the synoptic problem," end quote. And later, quote, "Like most other Jesus films, Jesus Christ Superstar has its fair share of historical implausibilities and even errors," end quote. Goodacre is talking about the movie, of course, but those errors and implausibilities he's talking about are just as evident in the music. So looking back, the show's not going to be true to the Gospels for a variety of reasons that have to do with any attempt of any dramatization trying to be true to a narrative that is itself not single and consistent. And looking forward a bit, in our next episode, we will explore one of the more mind-blowing connections I can imagine between the musical and ancient archaeology. The choices Tim Rice made for the show are so eerily prescient of an ancient text discovered decades after the show came out that it makes you wonder if there isn't some supernatural hand guiding all of this after all. But let's just say that the particular connection is not one that's going to make the Vatican or the Anglican Church or even the Trinity Broadcast Network very happy. Jesus Christ Superstar is a story of Christ, but it does question the divinity of Christ. At its core, for good and bad reasons, it strays considerably from the stories in the Gospels, and the final vision of Judas and Jesus it puts forward does probably hit the goal of humanizing both figures. But in a religious tradition built around the divine rather than the human side of Jesus, the story seems more of a challenge to mainstream Christianity than an affirmation of it. So, if a mainstream Christian theology is important to you, there is plenty in this show to make you unhappy. And there were indeed some very unhappy Christians about the show. Of According to Catherine Post, the BBC banned the 1970 concept album for being sacrilegious. The ban was partially successful. The album eventually sold something like 40,000 copies in the UK, but its popularity exploded in other places. The antipathy was not limited to the BBC. Quote, Christians bristled at the show's depiction of romance between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, its choice of Judas as narrator, and its lack of resurrection. Billy Graham said the show, quote, bordered on blasphemy, end quote, and in a 2021 interview, Ted Neely, the original understudy for Jesus on Broadway, said, quote, every single performance was protested by people calling it sacrilegious. They would try to keep us from going to the stage door, end quote. The protests may have been immediate and persistent, but Sternfeld has this take on it. Quote, on the day the show opened, protests began. Outside the theater, a group of rather disorganized picketers held signs that crossed out superstar from the show's title and replaced it with phrases affirming Jesus' divinity, such as Lamb of God, end quote. And Ian Mills opened his 2023 article in this way, quote, in 1973, my grandfather organized churches across the Midwest to protest the arrival of Jesus Christ Superstar in local movie theaters. He urged his city council to ban the film. But 50 years later, I assign the musical in my New Testament courses, end quote. That's a lot of quotes, but they all give us a pretty good flavor of what the protest was like at the time. There was definitely a second sort of religious reaction, one that did not, as Larry Norman did, see the show as a welcome wave of publicity for Jesus, but viewed it as sacrilegious enough that it ought to be shut down. But Sternfeld reports that whether or not the religious groups liked it, the critics, who would have a lot to say about other parts of the show, totally understood that it was a retelling of the crucifixion from the perspective of Judas, and they were generally either fine with that or they even kind of liked the choice. They thought it was a good creative choice. It was something that made the story fresh, at least to them, and it provided an interesting take. The third group that took issue with the show were the active Jewish groups. Sternfeld can again give us the details. Quote, only one group mounted a calculated organized protest. The American Jewish Committee, with the backing of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, released a statement which spelled out their concerns. The show, and now quoting the American Jewish Committee, unambiguously lays the primary responsibility for Jesus' suffering and crucifixion to the Jewish priesthood. The priests are portrayed as hideously inhuman and satanically evil, contemptuous, calloused, and bloodthirsty, end of the American Jewish Committee's quote. Back to Sternfeld. The AJC made it clear that censorship was not their goal, nor was any implication of anti-Semitism, but they felt obligated to speak out against a show that could have a damaging effect on America's free-thinking and impressionable youth. The musical, quote, is at the center of the creation of a set of cultural images in the counterculture of America. It is the creation of a religious counterculture, end quote. That's again the AJC talking. With Caiaphas and Ananias as unmistakable villains, the AJC felt that both the New Testament and the more modern interpretations of Jews' roles in the event had been dismissed in favor of a view similar to century-old passion plays, end quote. Whew, that was a lot, but it does identify the Jewish reaction. We have talked about the passion plays in the past episodes, but they were these prominent middle-aged plays that very unambiguously place blame for the death of Jesus on Judas specifically and the Jews collectively, and they more or less justified a mini Kristallnacht in every city that they played in and on every Easter. I am not exaggerating here. The plays took on the flavor of a soccer-style pep rally for the citizens of each city to rampage through Jewish villages intent on wielding out personal beatings and property destruction, and there were, every year, deaths among the Jewish populations. Show that calls back to that goes a little beyond what we would now call problematic, and I think that the reaction of the Jewish organizations was an attempt to firewall that off. There is no doubt that the portrayal of the high priest in the show does create issues. Ian Mills, who you'll remember as the guy with the grandfather who protested the show, but who teaches Jesus Christ Superstar in his own classes, approaches the material this way, quote, Superstar's caricature of Jewish leaders is so overt that it provides a reference point for class discussions about problematic representations of Judaism. Criticizing Superstar helps students build a vocabulary for identifying related tropes and rhetoric in early Christian literature, end quote. That is an excellent point. It demonstrates to me that Ian Mills can identify the anti-Semitism that is in at least that portion of the show. I'm glad that he's using it as a launching point to critique the anti-Semitism. I don't think the American Jewish Committee is wrong to worry that not everybody's going to take it the way Mills does, and they'll just present the idea as if, yep, that's what Jewish leaders look like. And John Dart, writing for the LA Times in 1973, said, quote, the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council scored it as, quote, and now this is Dart quoting the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, quote, singularly damaging setback in the struggle against the religious sources of anti-Semitism, end quote. And finally, as noted by Ian Mills, the show is also a callback to the earliest church maneuvers to minimize the guilt of the Romans. Again, Pontius Pilate gets a pass, although he easily could have stopped Jesus' death. And although Pilate is the guy who has the final call, and it is Roman soldiers who arrest Jesus, and it is the state of Rome that in fact crucifies him, it is the Jewish high priests who are portrayed here as the villains. We have talked previously about why that's in the texts. We'll talk a little bit about that more the next time, but that telling of the story where the Rome gets a pass and the guilt is placed on the Jewish characters is very much part of Jesus Christ Superstar. And the timing of that was especially poignant, as we have discussed in previous episodes. Some especially anti-Semitic clerics in the early church wrote about deicide and put it into church doctrine. The words aren't explicit, but the concept wasn't hard to figure out. And it wasn't until the mid-1960s, or 2 decades after the Holocaust, that the Catholic Church officially repudiated the notion that the Jews were collectively to blame for the death of Jesus. So for a show coming out in the early 1970s with some passion play callbacks, it was especially disturbing. Now, I will say that as a counterpoint to all that, Judas is portrayed as much more sympathetic than he is in most tellings of the crucifixion story. And sort of refreshingly, all the disciples and Mary Magdalene were just portrayed as Jewish in a way that's normal and in a historically accurate way, shows the original Jesus movement in the first century is deeply rooted in Judaism in a way that none of the players see as problematic. The reaction of the AJC seems very mature and balanced in this regard. Unlike the Christians, they weren't calling for censorship, and instead they just wanted a dialogue about the Jewish identity that was more inclusive and affirming. In the end, I will say that as the scales tip, the majority of scholars that I have read do conclude that there are indefensible strains of anti-Semitism woven into the show. The majority do conclude they should be a jumping off point for what we academics call interrogation or maybe critiques of racism in general and the portrayals of Jewish people in particular. And as a brief insert here, I should also mention that there was some objection to Judas being portrayed by a black man, Jewish being hated, and that being a lot for a performer of color to bear. But the guy who played that was Ben Vereen, and almost everyone who saw the show thought he was awesome. And so that strain of concern was fairly cursory, at least as we look back over history. The concerns about the portrayal of Jews seem more problematic than the fact that Judas was played by Ben Vereen. There is more to this whole landscape than I have touched on here, but a useful grouping of the religious reaction was that there were some new wave Christians who embraced the show as giving Jesus more cultural relevance. There were some more old school Christians who protested the show because it ran contrary to some foundational traditional Christian beliefs. And there were Jewish groups who were dismayed that the show seemed to dredge up some of the worst stereotypes history had conjured right at a time where progress on the specific question of Jesus' death was being made. And so, like I said, if religious beliefs are important to you, there were elements of the show that were going to kindle a conflict. So the first thing that is going to play a role in the reaction to the show is the religious content. That's our first thing. The second thing that's going to define the reaction to the show is the music. And I'm mostly recapping here. And as I said earlier, the show is immediately preceded by the most successful double album of all time. A full-length 2-disc album came out in 1970 that would outsell Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles. As detailed in previous episodes, among the millions who loved the album were a host of performing groups who immediately saw its potential as a stage production. And even before the show came out on Broadway, a major challenge of the production team was that scores of these bootleg performances were popping up all over. Some were just concerts. Some had lighter staging. And we talked about one show at a place called Gettysburg College that packed the rafters, but had to run as a no-charge dress rehearsal performance due to legal issues. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a big deal because the plan for Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber all along was to use the album as a vehicle to get the stage show produced. And that was working really well. It had never been done before, so they were concerned that these bootleg performances would would steal some of their thunder, the fact that there were so many bootleg performances kind of shows that the music on that album was striking a chord with people who did performance stuff in theater. So that meant that a lot of reaction to the stage show was going to be how well it fit with an already successful album. Let's go back to Jessica Sternfeld, who writes, quote, Alan Rich, lively arts critic for New York Magazine, had disliked the album intensely and was not at all inclined to change his mind now. O'Horgan's staging just made it worse. John Simon, theater critic for New York, also had not liked the album and had the same reaction as Rich. Staging did it no good. Richard Watts of the New York Post agreed he found the score fine, if dull, but found the live action flat, pallid, and actually pointless. Most critics, however, had liked the album and enjoyed the music in the show, but were distracted by the staging, which led to mixed reviews. The Village Voice, among others, falls into this category, end quote. So, if you hated the album, you probably hated the show. And if you liked the album, you probably liked the show. And if you liked the album and wanted to like the show, but were put off by the staging, you still liked the album and just wish the show had been staged better, or at least a little bit less weirdly. And most people fell in that category. They liked the music, but not the staging when they saw Jesus Christ Superstar performed live. Which gets us to the third main reaction of the show, which is how weird the staging was. This we covered extensively in the last episode, but let me just remind everyone of a few key phrases. Fish, man in the moon, Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, gigantic false teeth. Marshmallow Men, you ask? Why, yes, they were supposed to represent guilt, and they danced around Judas a lot, but also around Jesus. Suffice it to say that not all audience members made the connection between the puffy dancers and the emotion of guilt. The fish and the gigantic false teeth were part of what the cheering crowds waved at Jesus, not your more traditional palm fronds and whatnot. And I have read many things and even tried to hone my Google searches to figure out what was up with the false teeth. But all I can say is they definitely were there. The critics definitely noticed them. And I'm not sure what they were supposed to have to do with the show. The most unfortunate thing was that all this over-the-top staging overshadowed any critical attention to the music. Quote, most reviews demonstrated a massive but probably unavoidable imbalance. A great deal of space was devoted to O'Horgan's monstrosities, leaving less for Lloyd, Webber, or Rice. The existence of the album, the controversy over the material, and the publicity caused by the protest meant that in the end, far less than usual was said about the music, end quote. And that is Jessica Sternfeld. So let's pause and take stock of what actually happened to the show. There were objections by religious groups, but as a historical fact, those didn't seem to shut the show down. For Sternfeld, quote, the protest garnered much attention in the press, but did not rally other Jewish groups, nor did it result in any changes to the show, end quote. The same could be said of the Christian objections, and the Passion story from the perspective of Judas did not really seem to bother the critics. Now, as a communication scholar, I would hate to suggest that the media sometimes gloms onto controversy and negatives to create the appearance of conflict when it's mostly a creature of their own creation. Like that never happens except for all the time, and the internet is making that much, much worse. But something like that does appear to have happened here. My take is that the real Bible scholars didn't get too upset because they realized how hard it is to say that you know the Judas story in the first place. The religious groups themselves were split between those who loved the attention that Jesus was getting and those who didn't like the story. And to the critics, the Judas perspective was kind of a neat net positive, and the whole thing mattered a lot less than the crazy staging and the great music. But that staging was something that generated a huge net negative for the press reviews. So the show did fine for its first 8 months where it had advanced sales. And after that point, the reviews dampened the enthusiasm for the production. It closed in 20 months, which is still not bad, but not a mega musical. And then it returned to London, where the staging was toned way down and the show became the icon that it is today. So that's what did happen in reaction to the show and its themes. But there is a related question of what should have happened. And there are more details to dive into there. Here, I'm going to turn to James Huffman, who is writing in the Journal of Popular Culture right around 1972. So this was right around the time that the show was running in New York, and a year before Larry Norman is mocking John Lennon in his album. Anyway, it's right at the time of the show's release, and I gotta say, I am very taken with the way Huffman approaches his reaction to the show. I don't want to go all meta on you and everything, but Huffman is writing a critique of theater critics. Huffman starts his article with a quote from Dan Morgenstern, or a reviewer for a publication called Downbeat that was written in 1971. And it reads, quote, Is Superstar a cynical attempt to cash in on the current counterculture trend towards religiosity, end quote? That is our first explanation in this episode, and that shows that it was a pressing question at the time. Huffman then very quickly connects this to a pattern. What happens when you're a critic and you review something that you hate, but the public obviously has a taste for it? Well, points out Huffman, you tend to think that the gullible public has been duped by a charlatan who doesn't understand true art the way the critic does. Huffman uses the word misanthrope. I like that. Hey, if you can toss a big word into a pop article, great. But before we bash these critics too hard, let me just say this is a common thought. Wherever you are right now, look into a mirror, look yourself in the eye and be honest. What do you really think of the Spice Girls? Or if you're in my generation, Nickelback. What do you think of the painting Black Fire 1 by Barnett Newman, which is basically a canvas painting painted black on one side and beige on the other with a vertical black line on the beige side? What do you think about that? Is that high art? It sold for $84 million. Does that strike you as weird? Or have you ever voted for a political candidate and lost? And then you wondered how on earth 51% of the voters could be so stupid that they voted for the opponent. Part of the reason that the thought is so appealing to a critic is that we have all had that thought at one time or another. Or, as we have learned, if we've learned nothing else from the musical careers of Donny and Marie Osmond, there are acts that were once popular that in hindsight have lost their shine. Don't you ask me how much I paid for my pet rock in the third grade. And maybe that means there wasn't too much there in the first place, which has to mean that there was a time when there was something that was popular but was also crap. And if you're a critic, it might just be your job to try to call out when that's happening earlier than others. But Huffman does not like this trend. Quote, but all too many popular critics continue to hack away at popular artists as though they were totally dead wood and fret much more about the hallowed keeping of the public taste and morals than perform the more valuable critical tasks of analysis and judgment, end quote. What Huffman wants is for critics to shut up about saying they're the true protectors of culture and that the popular acts are just fooling all the people some of the time and making a quick buck off of current trends. And what he would like to see critics do is to actually analyze the content of what's happening and make judgments about it. And what Huffman does that I like so much is to look up the information and compare it to the reaction to see if it can be true. Is Jesus Christ Superstar popular because it panders to a new Jesus youth movement? Well, one way to know the answer is to see who it was that was buying all those tickets. Huffman writes, quote, young people's reactions vary a great deal, just as their new votes do. The super faithful consider Superstar blasphemous and perverted. Others feel it raises the right questions, but doesn't provide any of the answers. And some think it's fairly good. Some think it's great. Perhaps the only common denominator is that most think it's worth listening to at least once, which brings us back to our starting point. The Jesus movement seems to have little to do with Superstar directly, though the religious revival they represent may have some vague general influence, which helps make this the right moment for the work. Many fundamentalist groups are against it. Some zealots, calling themselves Jesus freaks, even picketed the show opening in New York, end quote. So, explanation number one, the show succeeds because it panders to the Jesus movement is probably not true. And we know that because, as Huffman points out, if you go back and watch who it was that loved and hated the show, it was not true that it was just that there was a universal reaction from the Jesus movement. So on to explanation number two, is it an affront to Christianity, an even more cynical attempt to capitalize on the there's no such thing as bad publicity formula for entertainment? Does the show do something sacrilegious to generate controversy to get free publicity and promote the show? Huffman again, quote, although the management expected the most trouble from the Bible Belt, Midwest and South, traveling companies played to their biggest groups, the Mary Poppins family audiences in just these areas, and got standing ovations, end quote. So, Jesus Christ Superstar doesn't succeed because it panders to Christians, and it doesn't succeed because it provokes Christians either. The third key factor, the weirdness of the staging, that just seems to have been a bad idea that needed to be discarded for the show to gain its second life in the UK. If we want to know why Jesus Christ Superstar succeeds, we need to figure out what it is that was good enough to survive the very non-biblical giant set of false teeth. Huffman has this answer, quote, "Works like Jesus Christ Superstar, which ask the right questions but allow each individual to provide their own answers, will be appropriated by nearly all the atheists, the agnostic, and the believer. Only the indifferent will remain unimpressed. Only the devout and aesthetically critical may be offended. Since Superstar is basically neutral, it can profit from nearly everyone's inertia." End quote. Maybe. But doesn't that beg the question of what started the inertia in the first place? And there's something to be said for producing something that appeals to a lot of people, sure, but history generally does not regard the neutral as having a lasting and powerful influence on culture. Is what Uncle Tom's Cabin does that's so memorable was that it took a neutral take on the institution of slavery. Was A Christmas Carol, a great story that raised questions about poverty and economic inequality, but everyone come to their own conclusions about it. Does Shakespeare and Hamlet with, yeah, be or be not, whatever, they're both fine choices, end quote, or as Bender the Robot said,
"How can I live my life when I can't tell good from evil?"
They're both fine choices, whatever floats your boat.
I generally think that things that just ask questions without answers are unsatisfying. And most audiences feel that way too, or at least it might be possible to raise questions without answering them in a particularly appealing way, but the formula of don't take a stand and that will boost your commercial success is a place, I guess, where Huffman and I finally part company. I have given Huffman a little bit of a short shrift here. He's got a more elaborate defense of ambiguity than I'm presenting in this caricature, but I think it misses the main point about the show. The main thing about what makes the show work is the music. Huffman kind of talks about the music. Our friend Jessica Sternfeld, as always, has a very detailed analysis of it. Everyone always points out that the Andrew Lloyd Webber music draws on a bunch of different influences, from the soaring classics to the tin penny pastiche. But whatever he's doing, it works. People like Memory from Cats. In fact, popular singers like it so much they re-record it constantly. And they like Jesus Christ Superstar. The question that has never been answered before the show was whether you could use a double album LP as the basis to launch a Broadway musical. And the answer is not only yes in the most resounding terms, but that the formula of the great album to Broadway launched a whole new era that is now called the megamusical. Jessica Sternfeld is a scholar of musical theater of the highest order, and her history goes roughly like this. There is a Broadway golden age that runs from Oklahoma in 1943 to Fiddler in 1965. Then it's the Sondheim era. Then there's a bit of malaise before Andrew Lloyd Webber explodes on the scene and launches the age of the megamusical. And it all starts with Jesus Christ Superstar. And I don't think there's any doubt that there is no musical without the album. At the very least, I think you can say that the album was absolutely critical to the success of the stage show. The fact that there were so many amateur, church, and community groups staging the performance based solely on the album means that the music was really, really good, and good enough that people were willing to go and see it performed before there was staging of any sort. And even without knowing how ambiguous the final plot was going to be. If you like the album, which a lot of people did since it was the best-selling double album of all time, you wanted to see the show. If your explanation for the success of Jesus Christ Superstar doesn't focus squarely on the music, you are kind of missing something. As Huffman points out, many critics did. And I think Huffman's analysis kind of shows that while the critics were having a collective fit about staging and hurling accusations about how the show fit into pop culture or what it was going to do to high culture or whether it was fooling all the people at least some of the time, all those folks in the Midwest and at Gettysburg College were just listening to the album and having a great time doing it. If there is a lesson for theater that we can take from Jesus Christ Superstar, it is that if you're going to do a musical, you gotta have great music. In fact, the lesson might go so far as to be that if your music is good enough, you can have a really successful show, even if the staging is a postmodern catastrophe gone wrong and the plot is a bit of a yawn. There's also something to be said for seeing music performed live. That is a lesson I take from this. I have made allusions to the 1973 movie. Mark Goodacre, our scholar from Duke, spends time analyzing it and makes good points about Jesus being a three-dimensional character, being capable of change, about the relationship with Mary being very human and profound, whether it's sexual or not. And he points out that the director uses some clever camera angles to emphasize points in ways that film can do. and other media cannot. In the end, Goodacre finds that the film is 15 years ahead of its time, but he ends by noting that it was not very well received, and the most it can claim is a cult following. To me, it shows to me what the plot of the show is not. And with apologies to James Huffman, it's not enough to draw in audiences fascinated by the ambiguous presentation of questions that allow them to take away their own answers. For me, the contrast of the movie with the album is fascinating. I have probably listened to The Wall by Pink Floyd hundreds of times. Heck, as a younger person, I've even gone to the Griffith Observatory to watch the Pink Floyd laser show more times than my undergraduate budget should have allowed. But I have seen the movie exactly once, and I didn't really want to see it again. Weird, isn't it, that you would prefer to listen to the music version without any video than watch a video with music that you like? I mean, it's the same music, right? But there's something about how the music gets presented that makes a difference. And listening to an album is something that rings true, and watching it live brings all that music more alive, and as all live performances music do. But watching the video just doesn't do that. The lesson for theater that the one that the Jesus Christ Superstar production brings home for me is that you can perform great music and it can carry your show, but that same thing is not true for film. A bad film with a good soundtrack ends up being a CD or I guess now a Spotify stream that people want to listen to but not watch. The lesson for life is that although it is now common to think that we live in this contentious world, there's actually far more agreement than you'd think. There is massive and widespread support for creating legal pathways to citizenship for immigrants. And truly, our immigration system is a mess, especially the laws for asylum. And we are obviously in a situation where our economy more or less depends on the labor of people we refuse to grant citizenship to. The whole legal apparatus is a total mess. Just trying to get a hearing date takes a decade. There's not like a line or easy way to do it. And amongst the hardcore right, there is still mass opposition to any form of immigration and a push to deport everyone possible. But that is very much a minority viewpoint. The same is true of abortion and nuclear weapons and Social Security and just about every issue. There will always be a hardcore and very vocal 20 to 25% of the U.S. population that will care a lot about a no compromise position. But the overwhelming group of the rest of us, there's widespread agreement for the middle way. And the trick is to make it so that the loudest, most extreme, and most fundamentalist voices don't set the agenda for everyone, which they usually do. So when I say trick, that certainly doesn't mean that it is easy, but I do think that that's what we can learn from Jesus Christ Superstar. Given the subject matter and the decidedly middle-of-the-road interpretation the show was going with on the question of who Jesus was, everyone expected there to be mass backlash. The BBC censors did. The critics just took it as read that those in the emerging Jesus movement were either going to love it or hate it. Everyone braced for a huge fight, and in the end, it just had its run on Broadway, was propelled forward by its masterful music, held back by its bizarre staging, both artistic elements. And but for a few minor protests and some angry articles, the show was, as they say, simply going on and played just as well in the most conservative parts of the Bible Belt as it did in the most freewheeling parts of California. And I at least find some comfort in that. What makes art work or fail is its own merits and not the rigid political viewpoints of the most extreme voices. The lesson for life is that we have to jealously guard that. If you want a historical example of what happens when the radicals take the helm, just tune into any podcast about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or the rise of Hitler. It does not end with good Broadway shows. Okay, that will do it for now. The show works because of the music, the religious themes, and kerfuffle work out pretty much how Rice and Weber thought they should, but despite themselves, they said they were trying to be artistic and not theological. But you can't retell the Jesus story and make him far less divine without making a theological statement, and you can't remake Judas without having a profound statement on Judaism. Yet, despite all this, the audiences mostly reacted to the artistic elements of the show, and the religious angle, while not absent, was not dominant. The lesson we can take for life is that you can predict what the loudest voices will say, but that doesn't make them right or even advances anything like a consensus. And in an encouraging way, good art can overcome bad politics. We are now at the end of the show where I introduce our next episode. And this time, I'm going to do it with a quote from Douglas Adams' masterwork, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Quote, "There is a theory which states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it is here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. There is another theory which states that this has already happened. End quote. What Jesus Christ Superstar definitively did, what all the critics noticed and generally liked, what you can't really miss about the show is that it retells the crucifixion story from the perspective of Judas. That is revolutionary since for at least 16 centuries, Judas has been vilified over and over so often that even the name is synonymous with betrayal, and few can quibble with Peter Stanford's assessment that Judas is now the most hated name in history. So, retelling the Jesus story from the perspective of Judas, which has got to make the figure of Judas more sympathetic and the figure of Jesus more complicated, is a big deal. It's what created the religious controversy of the show, and it's what Tim Rice in particular thought was an artistic choice that made the narrative interesting. No matter how you slice it, telling the story from the perspective of Judas is the defining hook of the show. And what if, as Douglas Adams might not be surprised to hear, that had already happened? Long, long ago, at the very origins of Christianity, in a lost gospel that was written, sealed away, and uncovered more than 1,000 years later, and only after the musical had its day. Something that amazing couldn't really happen, could it? We will get our collective Indiana Jones on in the next episode of Theater History and Mysteries, and beware of the snakes.